Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for coming this evening on a beautiful summer's day to discuss ticks and mice and tick-borne disease. But before we do that, we're going to start with some music. So please, everyone, welcome Coco Vent.
Tick check, 1, 2, 1, 2. Tick check. I thought about that a few days ago. So when we were contacted to see if we could write a song about ticks for this event, we were pretty excited about it, but the thing is, Caleb Cressman had already written a song that was featured on The Tick, Season 1, Episode 9. So we figured we'd do that one first, and then the one that we wrote specially for this event. Sure, you okay? It's on your phone? All right. This is the new song we wrote for you all. It's the first time anyone's heard it. Well, that's not true. There's a preview last night. Tick tock sick, 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 tick tock sick. Giggling, wiggling, rolling around, can't do that no more. Everything fun that we used to do, my mom makes us do indoors. Tall grass, short grass, running around, just wanna jump in the leaves. Small fry bullseye, red and inflamed, now I got a brain disease. Why can't someone help us? All this pain just from a little tick. Why isn't someone on this? It's 2018, they've mapped the gene. Please somebody science this shit. White socks hiked up, pants stuck in, not a good look, no way. 8 legs, blood sucking into my skin, looking for a place to stay. Dog, cats, mites, rats, nape on my neck, ain't nothing safe that breathes. Small fry bullseye, red and inflamed, now I got a joint disease. Why can't someone help us? Try as we might, we can't sing the ticks away. But we best be cautious. The climate's changed, you're bringing Pinky in the brain. Is this genius or is this insane? Giggling, wiggling, rolling around, can't do that no more. Everything fun that we used to do, my mom makes us do indoors. Tall grass, short grass, running around, just wanna jump in the leaves. Small fry bullseye, red and inflamed, now I got a brain disease. Now I got a joint disease, and now I got Lyme's disease. Hey. Thank you. We're that tick band.
So, thank you everyone, and particularly to to Coco Van for the amazing music. And on thematic music was certainly more than we expected. So again, we are here to talk about tick-borne disease, and specifically about one particular option among many potential control measures for this problem. But it is called Mice Against Ticks, and it began here on Nantucket at a Board of Health meeting about 2 years ago. And the idea here is that we need to do something, because tick-borne disease is more common than mosquito-borne disease in the United States. It is in fact much more common. There are nearly 300,000, in fact there's probably more than 300,000 cases of Lyme disease in the United States every year, according to the CDC. And it is increasing every single year. Those cases, as you can see, are concentrated in the Northeast, and Massachusetts is particularly hard hit. And if you look on the right here, I guess you can't really see that in my laser pointer here, Nantucket is among the worst affected areas in the country, and therefore in the world. Why is there a problem? Well, it's an ecological problem. That is, the ticks get infected when they bite a white-footed mouse, most of the time. The mice get infected when they're bitten by an infected tick. So neither of these is born infected. It's an ecological cycle. And that means that when you have lots of mice and lots of ticks, you have lots of infected ticks, and that means lots of infected people. People always say, well, where do the deer come in to this cycle? And The deer determine how many ticks there are, because ticks bite 3 times in their lives, typically mouse, mouse, deer. So we at MIT came up with this idea, which said, what would happen if we immunized the mice? Now, mice are not the only what we call a reservoir of disease. The ticks can get it from other things, but when a tick bites a mouse, the tick almost always gets infected. And when a mouse gets bitten by a tick, the mouse almost always gets infected. And that's not true for anything else. So if we immunize the mice, then we think that we can reduce the rate of tick-borne disease by 90, maybe 99% in places like Nantucket, where the mice are incredibly important. The reason why Nantucket has it particularly bad is in part ecological change. When you have lots of forests and you break them up, and you have lots of deer, then you end up with lots of ticks, and you have lots of white-footed mice. And so you end up with this positive feedback cycle, more and more and more infected ticks. But if you're talking about immunizing mice, that is an ecological change. And the reason we're here today is because we shouldn't be doing research on ecological changes intended to change the shared environment without involving the community. And that's just because if we develop a new drug, then your doctor can recommend that you take it and you can always say no. If we develop a technology to change the shared environment, you can't opt out of that if your community decides to move forwards. It's a matter of civic governance, and that means if you don't have a voice from the project in the earliest stages, then you're denied a voice in decisions that will affect you someday. So the idea here is to make the smallest possible change that could possibly solve the problem. And we think that involves taking naturally occurring resistance elements that already exist in some mice out there and ensuring that they're present in as many mice as possible on the island of Nantucket. So when we get infected by a cold virus, say, our immune systems evolve new cells that can recognize that particular virus. And that's why you don't get sick from the same thing twice. You acquire immunity. Now, our idea then is, since mice do this too, let's identify the immunity elements that some mice have acquired, and let's encode them in the mouse genome, in their reproductive cells, so that they can pass it on to future generations. Because sadly, I have 2 kids. They are not allowed to tromp around in the forest unprotected, sadly. But if I was resistant to Lyme disease, they wouldn't get it. So even if you received the vaccine when it was available, and yes, there was a vaccine, it is no longer available, but even if you were vaccinated against Lyme disease, your children would not be protected because that's not how our immunity works. But now with new tools, we can take that naturally occurring immunity from some mice, in fact, from many different mice that have different forms of immunity, and we can stack them all together and put them in a mouse so that it is inherited. We can do that without using any non-mouse DNA. That is, again, we want to take a naturally occurring element, which is unlikely to cause any untoward effects, and make it inherited by future generations. So the number one question we get is this going to cause unexpected ecological effects? And the answer is we don't know for sure. Ecosystems are complicated. We can't tell you for sure whether or not there might be ecological effects. That's why you have to start small somewhere else, a small, mostly uninhabited island. And I'll get to that in a moment. But the number 2 question we get is, wait a minute, how are you going to introduce immunity among mice? And the answer is you have to release engineered immune mice. How many mice? Well, lots of them. And this is what people say, wait a minute, we don't want more mice in the environment. So here's where we have to be very specific. We have never before engineered an organism that can survive and reproduce better than the ones that are already out there. Please raise your hand if you have a dog. How many dog lovers do we have here? Raise your hands high. Lots of dog lovers. And all of you, I assume, think that your dog is the best dog ever. That your dog can do anything. So please raise your hand if you think your dog can outcompete the wolves in Yellowstone. No? Well, there's never been a known case of a selectively bred organism like dogs or a genome-edited organism that outcompetes the wild version out there. And we expect the same would be true here. If we take these mice with these naturally occurring immunity and we make it heritable, we don't expect that to benefit the mice. But if we release enough mice into the environment, then for some number of decades, it will remain present at a high enough frequency that any mouse that has it will be immune, and that will disrupt the cycle of tick-borne disease, and most ticks will no longer be infected. That's the idea here. But to do that, we have to release enough mice. So what does that mean? Well, the key is you need to release mice at the right time of year. Because in the early spring, it's after the starving time. There are many fewer mice than at any other point in the year. So if we release into a field that normally has 100 wild mice at that time of year, if we release 200 to 300 mice that are resistant to tick-borne disease, then most of the offspring will inherit the resistance. But that same field would normally have 500 to 800 mice towards the end of the year. So you're never increasing the population above the normal maximum that year. That is, you're not going to be overwhelmed with mice. There's still hawks, there's still cats, there's still limited food overall. You're not going to see mice beyond the normal maximum. Probably. And the reason I say probably is that we're talking about an ecological effect. The way to really know that this is true is to find out in a field trial. So the stages of the Mice Against Ticks project, right now we're in stage 1. When we first came to the community, we said, how do you want us to do this? And are you interested enough at all for us to begin? And there was a very definitive yes. We're not going to commit, of course, to releasing mice because there are no mice, but we're interested in having you create mice. So this is what we've been working on. And Joanna Buchthal, who is here, is the project manager, and she's been working in the laboratory of Duane Weissman at Harvard Medical School, who's an immunologist, to identify these antibodies that are protective against Lyme disease. And they have the first candidates. So the idea is we are going to encode these antibodies into white-footed mice. Then we would need to breed those mice with wild-caught Nantucket mice. Once we have enough of them, we would then release them on a small, mostly uninhabited island, somewhere near here. And we have 5 candidate islands, privately owned, that have expressed interest in being that field trial site. And so now we're doing studies to make sure that those are reasonably good matches for the ecosystem on Nantucket. That is, what happens on the island is probably what you would see here on Nantucket as well. So that's the goal. And that's critically important because, again, we don't understand ecosystems completely. The best way to find out what happens is to start on a very small scale and try it. The reason why we hope to hear from all of you is you live here. I don't live here. I don't know anything about the local ecosystem beyond what I've picked up by osmosis from Sam Telford, who's been studying tick-borne disease on Nantucket for 30 years. But all of you almost certainly know many things that even Sam does not know. And so to the extent that you think there is something that concerns you, something that you think might go wrong and would need to be looked at, we want to hear about it. We want to hear every concern and criticism that you possibly have, because we don't want anything to go wrong either. And we need to know before the field trial so that that can be looked at. And not looked at by us either, because we are biased. You should never trust an inventor to evaluate whether their technology is safe and effective. Because we're still human, no matter how hard we might try, we will fail. You need to have independent experts look at it. And that's why there's a data safety monitoring board of independent ecologists and scientists that would need to look at it and deliver a report to you. But the idea is release on these small islands, engineered mice, an equivalent number of wild mice, see is there in effect just releasing wild mice, and doing nothing, and then look at everything in the ecosystem that you think might go wrong and make sure that it doesn't. And depending on the results of that, if too many things do go wrong, then you would vote against releasing mice on Nantucket. And if something goes wrong, then you shouldn't. That's how it is. That's why we want to hear every possible thing, because we don't want to miss anything. And we hope that you can help us in that If Nantucket decides to move forwards, then it's possible that a similar version of the technology could also be used on the mainland. So this would have more implications. But what's really unique about this project is we felt very strongly that it be community governed. So we have in the audience a number of steering committee members for the Nantucket Governance Committee that the Board of Health has appointed. And I only see one right now, Danica's in the back, so I'm going to single her out. So Danica has talked a lot about the project, and if you have any concern or criticism that you're uncomfortable raising with us, she is a local resident. She is on record as being skeptical of the project. If you're uncomfortable telling us directly or bringing it up here, please talk to Danica, and she will make sure that your concern is heard and responded to. It's only my job to summarize it. And again, I am not an immunologist, I'm an evolutionary biologist. And I'm interested in ensuring that this goes right because I am an inventor. And I develop technologies for doing this, and I want to be sure that those technologies are only developed and used wisely. And that's why this community-guided science and collective scrutiny are so important, and why, to me, frankly, they're more important even than solving tick-borne disease, as horrible a problem as that is. So next we're going to have Dwayne Weisman come up and tell you a little bit more about how natural immunity works and how we would encode that in the mice. And at that point, we will break it up for questions in the panel, and I'll talk to you then. Thanks.
All right. I love giving talks holding a microphone like this. I feel like I'm gonna beatbox or something. So I'm an immunologist, and my job is to make the mouse. And so I want to spend the next few minutes to give you some sense of the immunology behind the actual thing that we're making. And it's just a brief overview, and if you have any questions, obviously, I'd love to discuss this further with you. So the overall concept here is based on an immunological principle of memory. So our immune systems are a very beautiful thing, and it has this memory component, and much of that we understand pretty well, and have been able to use that for some of the biggest health innovations in history. And what I'm talking about is vaccination. And so what I have here is a graph that we're going to discuss a little bit. And on this vertical axis here is what we can call now the immune response. And then here on the x-axis here, this horizontal axis, is just time. Okay, and so this primary exposure means the first time you encounter something, like an infection or a toxin or something that's not good for you. Okay, your immune response, your immune system responds to that, and there's some change that happens, so your immune system can attack that thing and eliminate it from your body. Okay, now there's this principle of secondary exposure and immune memory that occurs, and what happens is this. When you are exposed to the same thing again, you have something very interesting happening. You get this much different, much more aggressive, much larger response that is much more effective at clearing the thing that you want to clear in order to maintain optimal health, okay? And so the thing that I want you to understand for this is that this is basically three things. This secondary response is faster, meaning that this slope here is steeper. It's larger, so it goes to a higher point, so it's a larger immune response. And then this third thing here, which is, I think, the most interesting, is that it's better, that it qualitatively is better. Our immune system evolves in real time to have a more effective, qualitatively, in addition to the quantitative improvement in immune response. It's a beautiful thing. And so this is the concept of vaccination. So here, this could be a real primary exposure of a real infection, and you have some response, small response in comparison. And this is good for some, but it's not effective for many others. Okay? Some people survive, some people don't, that sort of thing. But the secondary exposure, so this can be a vaccine as well, and this is how it works. Because when you get the secondary exposure, that's actually the first time you see the real thing, and you sort of, we sort of encourage the immune system to do this for the first time, and it works very well. And the infection has a much more difficult time to establish itself, and it's cleared more effectively because of this principle of immune memory. Okay, so that's the thing that I'd like you to understand for now. There's a lot more to talk about regarding this, but this is the general principle that we're working with engineering these mice. So the second thing I'd like you to understand, which we'll talk about for the next couple of minutes, is what this is. What is this immune response that we're talking about? And it's slightly more complicated than what I'm going to talk about now, but a large part of it is basically antibody concentration, okay, that makes up pretty much most of the activity that we see here. And so antibody concentration, this is specifically antibody concentration against the specific bacteria. So the total antibody levels don't necessarily need to change much, but the antibody levels that are against the specific thing, that's what goes up in this fashion, and that's what changes qualitatively as well, okay? Okay, so now what is an antibody? So antibodies are made up of, they're proteins, they circulate in the body. They're made up of 4 polypeptide chains, 2 identical heavy chains, and 2 identical light chains. So the concept here is that it basically is encoded in the genome to form this functional entity here called an antibody, all right? The heavy chain is encoded here by a gene, and the light chain is encoded by the gene, by another gene here. And this is the thing that actually evolves to be a better warrior for your immune system to clear infections. So basically, that's what this is basically antibody concentrations against whatever it is. So the concept with making the mice is basically to immunize the white-footed mice in order to collect antibody genes from the white-footed mice, to collect the antibodies specifically that have this activity here at this high level. Okay, so we can identify these antibodies and extract the genes that encode for this activity of protection, and then engineer the mice so that they produce them constitutively. So it doesn't need to go through a vaccination stage anymore, or it doesn't need to be infected with something anymore. That it'll constitutively produce the right amount of antibodies so it's always protected. And as Dr. Esfeld mentioned, the benefit of this is that it's heritable. So these mice will be able to pass on those genes to other mice. And if you can release enough, then these genes will be spread throughout, and you'll have resistance. And in general, the infection from the Borrelia, the Lyme bacteria presence in the mice will go down. And so therefore, it'll go down in the ticks and then go down in the humans. And so that's the idea. All right, so thank you so much for your attention, and we'll move on to the next phase.
I'm sorry I didn't get much sleep. My name is Michael Spector. I'm a writer for The New Yorker, and I've been working on a book about these issues for some time, and in fact, 2 years ago, came to the first meeting on this island with Kevin and have thought about it a lot ever since. We have an amazing panel, and I'm going to introduce them, and then I'll ask them some questions, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions. You already know Kevin Esfelt. I'm not going to introduce him again. I think he'll get a big head. and Dr. Dwayne Weisman, who just spoke, who disappeared but is probably here, Ruth Faden, who is one of the most eminent bioethicists in this country, and Sam Telford, who maybe some of you know, has the unusual distinction of knowing more about ticks than any other human being, which I find delightful, but maybe others do not. I'm going to throw questions out. They're not necessarily for specific people usually, and you should all feel free to respond with questions. We'll do this for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll give you guys, since there's a bunch of you, a chance to ask your own questions. The first thing I wanted to ask is really a question of Kevin, which is a confusion that I have. There's the opportunity to protect against Lyme and the opportunity to protect against ticks. They're not the same thing. And yet, you're doing both? You want to do both? Do you want to explain? Oh, am I supposed to hand this to you? Oh, you have your own. Okay, cool.
All right. So when we first came to the community, our idea for how to do the science was to say, look, these are the technically feasible options. And are you interested in any of them, none of them, or all of them? And those options were, in brief, we are certain that we can make mice that are immune to Lyme disease. That's because Lyme disease is very well studied. There was a vaccine. We know what immunity works against. We can do that. The somewhat more questionable option is, can we make mice that are immune to ticks? And what does that mean? Basically, it means that when the tick bites the mouse, the immune system of the mouse has a strong enough reaction that somehow it forces the tick to fall off before it gets enough blood to survive and molt to the next stage. So the idea then is that all of the ticks that bite white-footed mice will just die. Now recall that most ticks that get infected with one of these diseases, or rather the pathogens, they don't get the disease, get it when they bite a white-footed mouse. So if all of those ticks die, then you've just eliminated essentially the main source of tick-borne disease. And the interesting part about that is, number one, it blocks the other pathogens apart from Lyme disease. And here on Nantucket, you have the highest rate of babesiosis, which is caused by a different malaria-like pathogen that notably is not treatable with doxycycline. So you get diagnosed with Lyme disease, or you just come down with a fever, flu-like symptoms here on Nantucket. Your doctor is very likely to catch it if it's Lyme disease. But if it's babesiosis, then the doxycycline will do nothing, and you need a different treatment. And babesiosis can be very serious if not treated appropriately. Long story short, you have half as much babesiosis, roughly, as you do Lyme disease. And Malcolm McNabb, who's been the chair of the Board of Health here for some time, has estimated that 40% of Nantucket households have been impacted by some form of tick-borne disease. So the problem here is, even if the Lyme disease vaccine came back, you have other problems. So we said, well, if we can make the mice that are immune to ticks, that would block transmission of everything, including Babesia. And so at that first meeting, people said, look, if you're gonna make engineered mice at all, then immunize them against Lyme and against ticks. And so that's the current plan. We're going to do our best. We're starting with Lyme because it's easiest. If we do that, we'll see if we can do ticks. If we can't do ticks, it's possible that that is not done in a way that we can make it be passed on with antibodies like Dwayne was talking about. Then we could try making immunity to Babesia specifically, or to the other pathogens specifically. But we would like to do the ticks just because it's sort of a one-size-fits-all. And most people seem to be okay with this notion of fewer ticks around. Just saying. It's also worth noting there really are more ticks than there used to be. So when this is a more radical environmental change, but it's pushing it back towards the historical norm, which is a little bit safer. But again, that's a community decision. The community said very clearly, if you can do it, then please do it. So those are the two different forms of immunity. And then the other major decision was, do you want us to just use white-footed mouse genes? Or can we use other forms of DNA? Now, as someone who does genome editing, if you say, you can only use DNA from this one species, that's like making us work with our hands tied behind our back. But this is your environment, it's your call. And the community said, the clear majority said, only use white-footed mouse DNA, don't do anything else. And so that's exactly what we're doing. So those are the options. Thank you, Michael, for giving me more time to expound.
That's okay, I'm gonna make up for it by annoying you now. When did the community decide that it was clearly the case that, the community, more than 7 people, decide that it was clearly the case that using DNA of something other than white-footed mice would be objectionable? And by using DNA of other things, we're talking about something you've heard of that we're trying not to discuss here because it wouldn't happen here necessarily, which is a gene drive, something that you would force genetic changes through an entire species by changing the genes. We can go into that in more depth if you want, but I'm just curious about when that was decided. Kevin.
Okay, well, the initial meeting was about 2/3 in favor of white-footed mouse DNA only. Now, that was about 30 people, if I recall correctly, 2 years ago. But subsequent conversations have convinced me that it's roughly that frequency, and the people who show up at these meetings tend to have a bit more of a technical background than the average for the population as a whole. And there's a definite correlation between more years of education in science, medicine, et cetera, and more acceptance of using foreign DNA. So based on that, I'm reasonably confident in saying there's a clear majority in the general population that would prefer that we only use mouse DNA, if that's possible. If it were not possible, then we might come back and have that discussion. But it might be interesting to see if people raise their hands here. Now, the difference is, if we could use non-mouse DNA, then it's possible that we could use, I would say, not the formal gene drive that Michael brings up. This is why I'm somewhat annoyed by that. That was the invention that
It's my job.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So a gene drive is a naturally occurring phenomenon in which a gene spreads in a population, even if it doesn't help the organism reproduce. It's ubiquitous. Gene drives make up more than half of our own genomes. What's new is this tool that we have now. You may have heard of it called CRISPR. It's a molecular scalpel that lets us cut and therefore edit just about any gene in any genome. Well, a few years ago, I pointed out that we could encode CRISPR in the genome, teach the organism to do genome editing on its own, and then it would edit the genome in successive generations. And long story short, this makes a gene drive that will spread through a population. But in that first meeting, I said I would not make you the kind of gene drive, even if you wanted it, no matter how much you wanted it, I would not make you the kind that would spread indefinitely, because some few number of mice will take the ferry. I'm pretty sure they won't pay the fare, but they will take the ferry. And our models have shown that that kind of gene drive, which we call sort of a standard drive or a self-propagating gene drive, that kind spreads indefinitely and only takes a couple for it to start taking off. So we won't build that one, but we are working on a version that is localized. It actually relies on genetic fuel and stops. So the upshot is, if you're to use that, we could release a lot fewer mice on Nantucket and then wait a few generations and it would spread on Nantucket. But because it relies on genetic fuel, when mice take the ferry, they will run out of steam and it will not spread on the mainland. So that is the advantage of being able to use foreign DNA. But it's also not a bad thing, I would say, to start with the simple version of just do the immunity.
I have no position on that except that I take the ferry and I live in Columbia County, New York, and we'd like to get rid of our ticks too. But that's for another day. Let's move to a different kind of question, which is one about democracy, which is one of the reasons this is an exciting proposal here. Because Kevin, more than anyone else, some other people too, has decided that science should be more open than it's been in the past. And he wants you, more than him, to make these decisions. And he always has said that, and I actually kind of believe him. Not supposed to believe scientists, but I do. But I'm curious about democracy. It's getting a bad name. And I'm wondering, what's democracy? What would make these things work in Nantucket? Would it be a vote of 50%, 51%, 72%? A plurality more than the minority? Would it be people who have summer homes or not people who have summer homes? I think those are, I'm asking you to think about these things, obviously. It will be your decision, but I would love it if you guys, Ruth, perhaps have some thoughts on that?
I do. Right. I do have some thoughts, and we've been struggling with this, and we'll continue to struggle this. Full disclosure, we have a home on the other island, Martha's Vineyard, on which there is a very parallel conversation going on which a very parallel conversation is on And I'm kind of in an awkward space here. I'm also on the steering committee on the vineyard for this project. So I'm a little bit confused and conflicted. We'll have to talk a little bit more about how that fits. But I just wanted everybody to know that about me. So where I sit, this may sound like if you have a hammer, you see nails. But from where I sit, the science is the easy part. And the hard part really has to do with the societal governance structure and how we figure this out. So I too believe Kevin in his deep sincerity, right? That somehow this needs to be community owned and community authorized. The details of that, what that would mean, how that would actually work out, huge, big problems. Now, if, that line, if it can happen here, it can happen anywhere, it's sort of the reverse. If it can happen here, it might not be able to happen anywhere, right? You have kind of a unique culture and a unique governance structure. You're small, isolated, you have one town. For what it's worth, we have 6 towns, those of you who don't know Martha's Vineyard, 6 towns, separate boards of select people, separate boards of health. A Native American tribe, the Aquinnah tribe, who has its own governance structure. It's way more complicated on the Vineyard than it is here on Nantucket. That said, what the right governance structure is for Nantucket is something that has to be discussed. Kevin said something very interesting when he was speaking. He said he wanted everyone to have a voice. Everyone having a voice is not the same as everybody having a veto. Right? This isn't going to work if one person, right, holds it up. Now, you could have a structure that says all we need is one resident of Nantucket or one property owner in Nantucket, and that's 2 different things, as we all know, right, to say no, and this project cannot go forward. If you proceed that way, and you could choose to do that, it means the project probably cannot go forward, period. It can't happen.
We should just all go to dinner because there's no way.
That's not going to happen. So then the issue is, right, so then the issue is, how do you decide this? Do you decide this by referendum? And then all the questions you raised, Michael, right? You could delegate it to your Board of Health or to the steering committee that the Board of Health has appointed. You can have a referendum. You can figure out what to do with the people who are property owners on this island who can't vote in terms of referenda and so on. So these are the sorts of things that I think have to be debated almost as much as the science has to be debated.
Yeah, I agree. As someone who spends too much time thinking about these issues, I do think the science is not easy. It's actually very complicated, but it's way easier than this other stuff. The scientists talk about fundamental problems and engineering problems. Engineering problems are problems you can kind of figure out after you've solved the fundamental problems. I think most of the scientists in this field figure they're working on engineering problems right now, but I fear the social issues are fundamental problems, which doesn't mean they can't be solved. I think this is a very historic attempt to do something that's never been done before. And I wanted to ask the panel about that. I mean, is there a precedent that anyone can think of in terms of experiment, and I know that's a word people don't like to use, but it is an experiment, either medically or ethically, that you can think back? We're talking about releasing, we're about animals that will alter the environment in ways that have never been done before, and it would be hubris and foolish to pretend that we can figure out every single thing that will happen in advance. You can talk about risks and benefits and come to I think, a wise decision about whether it's worth it. But has there ever been such a, can any of you think of such a thing? Sam?
Well, they're analogs. I mean, after all, mosquitoes that have been tinkered with have been released in places like Key West and Australia. Now, it's not heritable tinkering. That is, they don't pass on these traits to their offspring, but communities have been asked their opinion on whether they should proceed to release hundreds of thousands or millions of altered mosquitoes in attempts to block Zika virus transmission, for example, or dengue virus transmission. And those attempts have been successful, which means that the communities did not vote them down. That doesn't mean there wasn't any activism or people who are very skeptical about the idea. But nonetheless, we'll be seeing more and more of these kinds of experiments. And I think all of us realize that we do need to consult the communities when we do want to alter the environment.
Just to interrupt and be annoying again. So I actually wrote a story about this mosquito attempt to get rid of dengue, and I went to Brazil where they were working on it, and they did a really good job of informing the community about what the possibilities were. And I think most people in the families that were approached had one or more members that had had dengue. They were deeply affected by this disease, and they had no problem saying yes to this experiment. I then went to Key West, where the same group presented it to a bunch of, yes. I mean, demographically similar, upscale people, highly educated, and they were viciously opposed to the idea. And I think, to be honest, they were viciously opposed because it was a profit-making venture. And those people needed a profit to do it. But they were accused of, being evil and Monsanto and things like that. They were 6 entomologists from Oxford, and the community was dumping chemicals in all their backyards. It wasn't like they weren't doing anything. But it was very difficult. Now, when Zika emerged, they began to have a different view. So I have developed the view based on these experiences and also having been in Africa. If things affect you directly, you're much more willing to roll the dice a little bit. Roll the dice is a phrase that scientists hate, but there are risks. And if they don't affect you directly, then you wonder why you should bother. And I think most of you here have been, is there anyone in this audience who has not been affected by Lyme in some way, either personally or in the family? Is there one person? Okay, that's crazy. Oh, you don't. But okay, so basically, this is a thing in your life that's very important, and I assume you will do a lot to get rid of it without compromising the environment or risking your lives. What'd you say? Yeah. Oh, no, go ahead. Fire.
I think one thing that's important to recognize is there's some, of course, the CRISPR technology, the kinds of work that you see represented here, that's all extremely new, right? But there have been other attempts and successful attempts to modify animals and then to have them propagate and become dominant in agribusiness for a very long time and in husbandry before then. They've never been presented as experiments, right? This is a critical framing that we need to think about. The closest analog, maybe, in addition to the mosquito experience that is more recent, is the genetically modified salmon, right? So the genetically modified salmon, how many of you remember hearing about there was this genetically modified salmon? It's been around for a super long time. It's been years now, right? And it still has not been approved for distribution in the United States.
Oh, I thought it just was.
Just got approved, sorry. So it just got approved.
It only took 17 years. No
17 years, no problem, right? So 17 years, thank you for that correction. So 17 years. Now that's a very different kind of a context because it's something we eat. And also it's embedded in a deep and confusing social dispute about genetically modified food, which we don't want to necessarily go into here. But nevertheless, the point is, there was no attempt in any of these other sort of historical analogs to do anything like community engagement or community authorization of the sort that's being discussed here. This is different, and I think it's important to point that out. We have traditions of research involving human subjects. We have a tradition of research involving animal subjects. This is very different because it's the ecosystem that's the subject in many respects. And so we don't really have the right infrastructure in terms of the ethics, and we certainly don't have it in terms of a regulatory infrastructure. We're missing all of that. We're missing it nationally and we're missing it globally.
Let me just quickly ask one thing. Since you're talking about that, we're talking actually about informed consent, which is one of the bedrock principles of medical research. I think what you're saying is it's very difficult to get informed consent in a situation like this. I was in Mali looking at a group that's doing a somewhat similar attempt to get rid of malaria using CRISPR and genetic editing, and it'll be quite a long time till that comes to fruition if it does. But, that's a group of people who don't, it's not realistic to think that all of West Africa can give informed consent to having 50 million mosquitoes fly over their house. Again, we might have to change our views of informed consent. We might have to give up on a technology. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
I just want to mention another thing that's related to the question you posed to us about whether this kinds of thing have been done before. This is a little bit off of field, but there's a principle here that's related that I think is important to mention. Also, nature does this kind of experimentation continually, and there's a beauty with DNA and evolution, and there's a natural process of experimentation going on every day. And humans have been genetically engineering animals and plants for many hundreds and thousands of years. They haven't been doing it with these new technologies of taking an embryo out and doing the gene change. They've been doing it other ways, by selecting traits that arise by random mutation. So these are random mutations. These aren't, so mutation is natural in that sense. This is different, but there's an aspect that's actually better, similar, that it's we're thinking about it, and we're making a selection, and we're kind of engineering and thinking about it through. There's interesting things to discuss about that and how that's different or the same or both, complex. But cattle, domesticated animals that make up most of the biomass, I think, of the planet, according to this book from Harari, I guess I just read. So we've been making ecological changes in huge ways over the last thousands of years through this, down to the pigeon fanciers, to cattle, to corn, to whatever it is, you name it, we're kind of doing everything. And this is an accelerated and more precise kind of version to kind of go in there. And I think it's going forward, as you mentioned, in a very transparent and very nice way, with Kevin kind of, getting community involvement with this.
The other thing I want to point out is that in terms of scientific analogs to this sort of thing, there's this long history of people trying to deal with invasive species by bringing in a parasite or predator of the invasive species. And in general, bringing in a predator tends to work horribly because they like eating something else. But this is called biocontrol. It has a very, very long history. And the only examples that you have ever heard of are the times when it went wrong, which you would say is a lot, but actually the vast majority of cases now it went right, and there hasn't been a case that's gone wrong for quite some time now. But I'm not aware that anyone really went out and asked the community if that was okay, even though you would expect that new introduced species to spread in the new environment. Whereas here, we don't expect these mice to spread because resistance to Lyme disease and resistance to ticks doesn't help them reproduce. And again, there has never been a case in all the world in recorded history that, certainly I've looked for this. If anyone knows better, please let me know. But we've never had a human-altered organism outcompete anything in the ancestral habitat out there.
Here's another thing we've never had, and I'd love to be wrong about this, so if someone can point it out. I don't think we've ever had a technology developed as humans that we have not used. Some have failed and we stopped using them, but I don't know of any case where we've developed a technology from the printing press to nuclear weapons that we have not used as a race, as a people. And it's difficult for me to imagine that this will be the first of those technologies. It's also by far the most powerful. And powerful things can do wonderful and horrible things.
Well, hang on. When you say powerful, I mean, what we're talking about here is is genome editing using CRISPR, taking those naturally occurring elements and making them heritable. Now, no one's done that before, but you're still talking something naturally occurring, and you're talking about something that is not anticipated to spread in the wild.
No,
When you say
you're right.
powerful, you're talking about CRISPR gene drive, which, again, I hold myself morally responsible for any and all consequences, and I am painfully aware of the likelihood that someone will use it, and probably in ways that I don't consider wise. And that's part of the precedent for this. But
I mean, I
this
think-
is not that.
Totally agree. No one in this room should think that we're talking about this on this island. I also think it's silly to pretend that people like me are spending years here and many other reporters focusing on this issue just because it's about mice and ticks on Nantucket. It's about a fundamental way to change living beings permanently. And that is why we're so interested from afar. And it's, I think we need to recognize that when we're having these conversations.
Just, I'm sorry. Just a couple of points. Michael, I can't think of an example of a technology that has not been used, but there are examples of technologies that are regulated.
Oh, sure.
Right? And that's what we're hoping for, right? We're hoping to come up with some sort of a governance structure and a regulatory structure so this technology in its most powerful form and in the less powerful way in which it's being anticipated to be used here and in the Mice Against Ticks project, that's what we're struggling for. We're looking for the right regulatory regime and the right, governance structure so that this technology, which now that it's with us, is clearly going to be used, can be used in a way in which it produces more good than harm. And that's really what we're struggling for. On the informed consent point, this is not an informed consent context. It can't be. So informed consent works in the context in which you're making a decision about yourself or someone who you are responsible for, like a child or an adult with a cognitive impairment. And the question is whether you want to authorize that person's having surgery or you want to authorize that person's participation in a research project. And you do have veto power, right? At least in principle, you can say no. And to borrow from another very important movement, no means no, right? In that context, you have the authority. In theory, there are times in which you don't, but in theory, you have the authority, and the whole idea behind informed consent is you can say no, and no will stop whatever it is that would have otherwise happened. It would stop the surgery. It would stop the participation of yourself or that person in the research. We can't do that here, right? So it's not, this is much more analogous to problems we struggled with for a very long time in public health ethics, right? So in the ethics of public health, we have a regulatory regime and a structure that determines that the water is going to be fluoridated, that the bread is going to be enriched, that a bunch of things are going to happen. And we can't control that, right? We don't individually opt out of any of those things. So we've got that model to be thinking about, right? At the same time that we are talking about our experimentation of an ecosystem with a novel technology. And how do we come up with something new that draws on all of those traditions?
Could a public health regime, could an approach such as a basic vaccination approach work in this context, do you think? And by that basic vaccination, I mean you have to vaccinate your children to send them to school. There are certain exemptions people seek and places can get, but basically it is the community that decides.
It's the governance structure that's set up by society to make the calls about when vaccination should be mandatory or conditionally mandatory. So in theory, right, and this is why imagining how this might work, for example, in a kind of context in which there is nothing approximating even a flawed democracy. So when you think about the places in Africa where you've been, right, and try to imagine how this is going to work there, it's a whole other issue. But assume for the moment that we have a fairly decent government, and I'm not commenting now, but okay. Assume for the moment that we have a fairly decent government structure, and we have mechanisms in place that have been long tested and long relied on, like the Centers for Disease Control, like the Food and Drug Administration, and like Health and Human Services Department. And we essentially, as citizens, designate to those regulatory agencies the authority to make these decisions on our collective behalf. And sometimes we don't like those decisions. Some of us don't like them. There are always winners and losers in this context. You know, the FDA approves a drug, and some people are really upset about it. Most people are happy. The FDA refuses to approve a drug or takes a drug off the market, and some people are outraged because that drug works for them, right? It's not as if we can come up in public health policy with a context in which everybody is always happy. And this is going to be one of those situations, although it's a totally different dynamic.
You know, one of the things that I wanted to ask about, it's an immunological question, I think. We're constantly reading about new ticks and new pathogens. You know, when I grew up in Connecticut, there was nothing, then there was Lyme disease, and Lyme disease was not considered a terrible thing. We know more about it now. I never had heard of ehrlichiosis or babesia or anaplasmosis or any of these other things. Powasins. I mean, there are a lot of serious illnesses that can be conveyed this way. Are you going to have the ability to sort of alter the editing to react to different pathogens? Is that a reasonable hope?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the research approach is to identify the genetics that confer resistance to particular things. So the antibody approach is very straightforward because, you know, antibodies are so flexible and they carry much of the activity that we see like in vaccines and stuff. So the simple thing would be to make a system where you have a gene cassette that you insert that has, you know, a number of different flavors of antibodies that is against, you know, Ehrlichia and Babesia and Powassan virus, and so you have this cassette that's transferred genetically, heritably, that is like a super cassette that's against all these different organisms. So in theory, that's possible. The immunology would need to be done very carefully in order to identify all these different genes.
Sure.
And then to have something so huge, I mean, we're talking this huge thing that's going in, to make sure that doesn't dysregulate wherever it's going in. You know, there's all these considerations. But yes, absolutely, it would be a great approach to figure out what all this is. And maybe it's not antibodies, maybe it's some other gene or set of genes that, another part of the immune system or other kinds of resistance. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Although, hang on there. Just a quick caveat. When scientists talk about huge versus not huge, huge in this context means 1/100,000th the size of the genome.
That's right.
That to us
point.
is huge.
That's pretty big.
Huge, yeah.
Let me ask, I'm going to ask one more difficult question, and then I'll let you guys ask some difficult questions. Kevin, from the day that you came here, I was with you, that one of the first things that came out of your mouth was, this is not going to be a profit-making venture. We don't want it to be a profit-making venture. We want it to be a public good, putting aside the fact that it is possible to have a public good that's a profit-making venture, but whatever. Let's say you can't raise money in the way that you dream of raising money, and the only thing open to do what maybe everyone agrees is a really exciting venture is to raise capital in a corporate kind of way. Would you walk away from that?
I'm ultimately practical. There is a cost to doing nothing. If that is the only way forwards, then I would say do that because you have a problem, and if people are interested in solving it and that is the only way to solve it and people still broadly support that, fine. In this case, I don't think that's necessary. I think that there should be enough local support and hopefully philanthropic support to develop the project. I mean, we are one of the problems that we see here, and we have some people from the Rainwater Foundation that have made key donations, among others. We have some degree of federal support for this. It's hard to raise money for Lyme disease relative to other things due to politics at the National Institute of Health and the like. It's particularly hard to raise money for something that will only, for this version, again, work on an island. Because if you release these mice on the mainland, the version 100% mouse that we're talking about here, all those mice are going to be mate with wild mice from the surrounding areas, and it's going to be rapidly diluted out, and it won't work inside of a decade. So this really won't work on the mainland. You are going to need the somewhat, at least slightly more powerful versions. And we're developing things that would work for that. Our DAISY system that is genetic fuel, and we're working on ways of keeping it within town boundaries so that, and yes, we can actually teach genes to vote and respect invisible human boundaries on the line. We think we can do that. We have some good ideas for doing that so every town can make their own decision. But the point being, that the current version will only work on islands. And when you ask the federal government to chip in a lot of money to do something that will only really benefit Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, the program officers say, shouldn't you be able to like go to those communities and like raise some money? And that's not fair, but that's reality.
Yeah. Let me, before I turn it over to you, let me say something cheerful, because that is rarely said. One of the things, I'm writing about a bunch of stuff involving gene editing, and I've spent some time at the Broad Institute, which is Harvard and MIT, and some people there and at Berkeley have used gene editing, CRISPR, to develop technologies that will detect viruses really rapidly and inexpensively. And I think, just from my own experience in writing about Lyme and living where I do, one of the biggest problems here is not ever knowing if you're infected, what you're infected with. And I think in the not terribly distant future, you'll see much better diagnostics. It's not going to solve the fundamental problem, but it will be quite helpful, and it will not be expensive, and I don't think it will be difficult to get through regulatory approval, because it's not dangerous in any way, and it works really well. So that's the good news. Now I'd just like to open it to people. Are there mics out there, or am I supposed to? Oh, I'm supposed to repeat questions and give out T-shirts. I'm like a trained SEAL. Yes. Here are T-shirts. If you ask a good question, if I consider it good, I'll give you a T-shirt.
You're supposed to give everybody a T-shirt.
Go away. Oh, I'll give you all this, whatever. Go back to me. Hi.
I don't need a T-shirt or a mic.
Then you deserve a T-shirt.
First, what will be the ratio, male-female, of the mice from the weeds? Number two, I can see already reasons not to sterilize the mice as another alternative. We might even work on the mainland. But I can see reasons that that would not be as effective. Maybe you want to say that. And three, what if the pathogens mutate intelligently enough, like in billions that they reproduce?
The Jurassic
They
Park
skip
question.
mice, or goat squirrels, or voles, which are a lot on the island, or skip mice and small creatures entirely and just jump off the deer. What do you see about that?
You really don't want a T-shirt? I think you deserve a T-shirt. Okay, do you want me to repeat it? Yeah, he's louder than I am.
All right, so question number one, release males or females. In general, if you release, it's unless we're playing about with technologies like Gene Drive, it's very hard to have them only make males or females, meaning you will have males and females, and it is most effective if you release all of them. So probably the most effective way is just to release males and females in equal numbers, but there are variants that could be different, and again, if there is community preference for one or the other, then it is your island, it is your call.
That would be awesome. Just next, Jurassic Park.
Yeah, so again, mice are, and Sam, do you want to say a few words on the role of mice? I mean, so Sam will tell you that we could get rid of ticks, and what would happen?
Oh, yeah, the little kids ask me all the time, why did God make ticks? And I say, beats me. I don't know why they made mosquitoes either. But ticks serve no function in ecology. Once upon a time, this island didn't have ticks. And we could go back to that time when, if there were no ticks, it really wouldn't matter. But the mice themselves, we've considered things such as eradicating the mice. You could get rid of all the mice. But there are a lot of other animals that depend upon those. The raptors, for example, the owls, the hawks, they all depend on them. The snakes do. And they also, the mice themselves, prey upon things like caterpillars. So some of the tent caterpillars that were out there, they will eat some of those. And you can imagine if we remove a predator, how much worse that problem could be. So there are unintended consequences of things like removing the mice entirely. And so you could say, well, we won't trap them, we'll just sterilize them. The outcome would be the same. So we want to try to make the smallest possible change to the ecology that we can, and that certainly would not be eradicating mice.
Jurassic Park, please.
So You say, well, what is my role in this? Well, yes, in Jurassic Park, life finds a way, right? So I'm an evolutionary biologist, so this is my area of specialty. How, when, and how long will it take for life to find a way? And the answer is you give it enough shots on goal and it will eventually get past whatever goalkeeper you have out there. The thing is, it only gets so many shots on goal depending on how many organisms does it have, what is the mutation rate in those organisms, and are you rewarding them for getting close? So evolution typically requires stepping stones, getting closer and closer, and you have to actually reward the stepping stone. So the reason why we give you multiple drugs when you have, say, a virus for antiviral therapies, we call it cocktail therapy, multiple drugs that have different mechanisms of action of inhibition. And the idea with that is a virus that has a mutation already that makes it immune to one of those drugs will still be inhibited by the others. So in order to escape, it needs to acquire multiple mutations to resist all of the drugs in order to break out. The idea here is that we would do the same thing. So Dwayne, do you want to talk a little about antibodies recognizing different parts of a molecule?
Oh, sure. There's quite a bit of studies on this that show that there are different places on the microbes that you could target with antibodies that have a much better impact compared with other places on the microbe. And so, for instance, you know, the Borrelia spirochete is what it is because of the genes that it expresses and how it looks and its shape and things. And so you could target certain areas that we can identify that are highly conserved and are important for its function and also important for it to be what it is. And so if it mutates that, then it becomes weak and ineffective, can't, you know. So that's the kind of cocktail therapy, a group of antibodies, not just one, that target all the weak spots. And so basically it cannot function as it does. And so it would be highly unlikely for it to suddenly jump to another species. It would be highly unlikely for it to develop some kind of resistance, because this kind of battling is going on every day. Like, you know, spirochetes are mutating all the time. There's a chronic back and forth. And so we're not going to be really, you know, making anything happen that's not already happening. We're just going to be doing it in a way that's sort of designed to be effective at reducing, you know, the level of infection in a mouse.
So, yeah, so one additional point, to the extent that we target multiple sites that are important and a mutation is harmful except in a mouse that has our antibodies, then that's going to be selected against in those other organisms. So then you're going to have the bacteria select for it in the mice, but again, they're getting hit with all the other antibodies in the mice, but in, say, a chipmunk, it would be bad for it. And so that's going to be outcompeted by the original version that won't spread in the mice. So you have these competing pressures. And furthermore, it's...
Bye. Let other people ask questions. There's like, this guy's had his hand up since 1967.
You're totally right. Go ahead.
Mr. 1967?
First off, I want to say thank you so much for even having this forum. I really appreciate the attempts being made at community engagement. Who is the ecologist who's helping with this the most? Like, who would be a contact person for ecological questions?
I probably don't need to repeat that.
That would be me.
Sam Telford.
Sam, okay, sorry, I didn't realize the way that you introduced me, you didn't give any of your credentials. It wasn't like the way that.
Yeah.
He knows more about the ecology of this island, of mice and of ticks than anyone, I mean like a crazy amount, like a fetishistic amount.
I'm curious, what role do you think lions, so I know that you sort of kicked out, you're like, okay, ticks don't really matter for the island. What role is lions playing in the cycle, for example, like of the ticks and the mice? So does it have, for example, like, well, yeah.
Well, there are places where you have ticks and mice and no infection. There's some suggestion, a couple of reports say that if you infect ticks and you compare them with uninfected ticks, the ones that are infected are much more likely to be up on the vegetation looking for animals, and therefore it might be an advantage to the tick to be infected. Some of us don't believe those reports, but nonetheless, it's out there. There may be effects like that, but the ticks themselves don't need it. They do just fine without it. The mice themselves are not harmed either way. If they're very old or very young, maybe they'll get a few lesions, but they resolve. That certainly, I'm sure most of you know that there are plenty of mice out there. There's plenty of Lyme out there. It seems not to inhibit them at the very least. But the point is, this island didn't always have this level of Lyme disease transmission or tick infestation. There are plenty of places where there are mice and no ticks whatever and no infection like these going on, and those mice are doing just fine. And so one could speculate, yes, they do have some sort of purpose, but until we do the experiment, there's no way of really knowing. And historical precedent says it probably won't matter. And interestingly, a paper just came out about a month, maybe 2 months ago, by people who are concerned with the same question about what do we do if we're able to change or even eliminate the main malaria vector in sub-Saharan Africa, the main mosquito malaria vector. And they did a study of what the potential effects might be, and they concluded we see no evidence from the literature or from experiments that these the loss of these mosquitoes would affect the ecosystem. And so, like I said, why did God make these creatures? Beats me. There may have been no reason, whatever.
Woman with a baby. And I'm giving you a pink shirt. Since I'm back here, speaking to the mic and save me.
Thank you. I'm curious about the Lone Star tick, and because I've heard that it's becoming prevalent and even dominant in some areas, and I'm wondering whether we're keeping an eye on the ratio of those here on Nantucket, and knowing that they don't use mice at all in their process of spreading disease.
That is an excellent question. Nantucket does not have it yet. Although I have collected specimens, I started working out here in 1984. And I've collected specimens, one every 2 or 3 years, and always said, well, what a fluke. Maybe somebody brought it back on their dog. Maybe the back of my truck was dirty. I went down south and I brought them back. But Tuckernuck Island, right next door, it is now the dominant species of tick. It is now the dominant species of tick on Cuttyhunk Island, on Noshawn Island, on eastern Long Island, and it is a miserable pest. You will be sorry. And so that when it finally comes here, it's coming. Climate change is helping it move. We also have some evidence from the Rainwater Foundation has provided us some funds to do general ecology work on tick-borne disease in support of the Mice Against Ticks project, and we found evidence for a behavioral reason for why these Lone Star ticks may be expanding. And so they are coming, and that means that even though we're focused on Lyme disease and deer ticks, we still need to continue to do other things in the interim while these tools are being developed. We still need to protect ourselves with repellents. We need to treat our clothing. We need to take showers. We need to be aware of tick-borne illness. We need to modify the vegetation if we can. We need to use spraying wherever we can. We need to reduce deer if at all possible. The Lone Star tick is even more of a deer tick than deer ticks. And so all of these have to go on simultaneously. These problems are so bad that we have to throw everything we have against them. And the important part about Mice Against Ticks is that it's one of these things for the future. It's in the pipeline to add to our arsenal. And communities can pick from that arsenal, but we need to develop new tools because the old ones, I've tried for 30 years to get people to do things out here, and nobody's acted. This is one of those things where you have a potential long-term or even permanent solution, of which we have none right now. Everything that we do If we use repellent, if we stopped using repellent the next day, we're at risk again. If we clean up leaf litter, if we don't do it the next year, the ticks are back. Deer reduction could be a permanent solution, but sociopolitically that has not worked out here nor in many other communities.
Sam, they're going to commit mass suicide if you go on.
Well, you know, I was actually, Jim Lentowski and I were behind the 2005 extra hunting season, the extra deer take that happened here. And when the community decided to rescind that, had the selectmen write the Fish and Wildlife Board, I got so depressed that I actually spent more time on Martha's Vineyard working than over here.
Okay, we need to move on. You should have an HBO special.
Mine's highly technical, but it's for Dr. Weissman. When you talk about, yeah, don't worry about it. When you talk about creating multiple antibodies, that means multiple genes. When you're creating multiple copies of this gene, you have to put it into the DNA. That's going to be inheritable and move it on. Is it going to be purely autosomal, and how do you prevent the methylation that might actually deactivate the gene? And how do you also prevent over-phenotypic expression?
Okay, quick translation.
So how do you prevent the gene that you're installing from being inactivated, and on the opposite end, how do you prevent that gene from being overexpressed?
So this is an important point of where the genes go in the genome. And so luckily, scientists have been studying mice for hundreds of years. And even though the kind of mouse that we study is more than 20 million years away evolutionarily from the white-footed mouse, a lot of the genome structure is very similar. And so based on the many decades of genetic manipulation of different areas of the genome, we know areas that are stable and that can be fully expected to work as we expect. That said, we have to test. So the answer is really we have to make it and see. And as Dr. Esveld said, we plan to make the protein expressed from the liver. And so we plan to use a gene in its natural position to kind of tag the antibodies on to the end of the gene to have it expressed together with a particular protein that's only made in the liver, and express it in a way where we can measure the different doses. So we can do that. We can make different versions. So this isn't just one mouse we're actually making multiple different, like going to the supermarket and all the cereal versions. We have to do that sort of a thing so we can identify where is the right spot that's constitutively expressed.
I have a very unscientific question. If the world is perfect, this project is approved, the bioethicists are happy, citizens are happy, you get the green light. What does success look like? How do you measure this? How long does it take? How much does it cost? And what is the lasting impact for Nantucket? Is it one time only? Do you have to keep introducing mice? How long does this kind of hang around for? So
that sounds pretty scientific to me. So best case scenario would be a 99% plus reduction in the rate of all diseases spread by the deer tick, and a reduction in the deer tick population by about 50%, say. That's probably the optimistic case. Sam would probably say a little bit less, but that would be the best case scenario. And you would start seeing effects a year after the introduction of the mice if you did the fast releasing of, say, 300 mice in a field that normally has 100 in the spring at the low point. So 1 year later, you'd start seeing positive effects. How long it would take to get all the way down to the maximal reduction, we don't know. A colleague of ours is running mathematical models to try to get an idea of that, but you should see the first year, whatever fraction of mice, of infected ticks get infected by biting a mouse, 1 year later, you should see that fraction would be no longer infected. which is certainly more than 50%. In the very first year, you would see a more than 50% reduction, and then it would keep going because fewer infected ticks means fewer infected shrews, which are the sort of the secondary reservoir, which is not nearly as good at infecting ticks or being infected as the mice. So you'd still have shrews infecting some ticks. Sorry, a shrew is a small mammal that mostly lives underground and sort of mouse equivalent, but you see fewer of them. Not that you see that many mice. But alternative thing that ticks can bite and can also be a reservoir, just not nearly as effective at being infected and infecting the ticks. So many fewer ticks means fewer infected shrews, meaning the next tick generation, which is 2 years later, you then have even fewer infected ticks. So it's going to keep spiraling down. The problem now is we've dialed it in the other direction. We've made more ticks and more mice, which means it keeps going up and up and up and up and up. And that's why this problem keeps getting worse. But you take out the mice, and then it's going to keep going down and down and down and down and down, drive this process in reverse. How much money is it going to cost? Well, we're looking to raise about $500,000 for the next year to develop the first flavor of mouse, and ideally get leads on the future ones. Find out, can we do the anti-tick mouse? And then we'll need more funding after that. We would hope to ramp up, make more flavors of mice, make the best possible version in preparation for the field trial. Total project, you're probably looking somewhere like $10 million to $20 million. The total number of mice at about 200,000 to 300,000. Jackson Labs, and if you've been to Bar Harbor, big facility there, can't miss it. They make 1 million mice every year. So it's not that out of the ordinary.
Okay, we're back here in the audience.
I actually have a question and a statement. My question was specifically the 5 islands, the location, if you're able to let us know that today. And secondarily, if the town of Nantucket and the citizens of the island think that this is a good idea, I personally don't think that it's a problem getting funding. Because if Senator Murkowski can get a bridge to nowhere in Alaska, I would think that Senator Warren and Senator Markey would be able to step up and get funding for the program. But my question was specifically about those islands.
So right now, we are not able to disclose the names. They are all private islands. There's only so many private islands off the coast up and down, so you can look at the list and probably take a few guesses, but we're not at liberty to disclose the names at this time. Ideally, we would be able to do that in future, so and we can certainly disclose ecological data in terms of how good is that island as a match for Nantucket, because that is what is most relevant to you.
I'm curious what the panelists think conceivably could go wrong with this experiment and what the worst case scenario might be.
Choose.
The worst possible outcome is that it doesn't work. And the other is, we saw this with the Lyme disease vaccine. I was involved in those trials. And Block Island at the time, the Board of Selectmen there had approved and actually appropriated a large sum of money to eradicate the deer from Block Island. But then we started working on a clinical trial of the Lyme disease vaccine in 1995, 1996, and all of a sudden that enthusiasm went away. And so they could have really made a difference had they gone through with their original plan, but then they said, oh, there's a solution around the corner. We don't have to take this unpleasant step. And so as a public health person, I look at this and say, well, I hope people's hopes don't get up too far right now with the promise of these very powerful new methods, because we still have to do the same sorts of things we've been doing. We still have to realize this is a formidable foe. This problem didn't happen overnight. It's not going away overnight. We can't get overconfident. And so I don't see any downside ecologically. But that, then again, due diligence, you start small. What if the mice start poisoning, or start dying all over the place? That wouldn't be something we'd want to see. and we'd have to stop the trial then. But I can't imagine, because the changes that are going to be made, they're naturally occurring, this process of antibody production is a natural event. I don't see that this is anywhere near a Franken-mouse. This is just a natural mouse with a super immune system. And so I don't see any effects there, but I do see potential public health effects.
What I'd like to know is, what are the sequence of events and what's the timeline look like between now and when mice are in the wild type?
It's very hard to give you a realistic timeline, because even though most of this, certainly the anti-Lyme mice, is an engineering problem, it's not a science problem. A science problem means something could be really different from what we expect, and it just doesn't work at all. Anti-Lyme mice is really an engineering problem, and we can solve it. But it's still a research problem, and research and development takes time. You run into roadblocks. Maybe white-footed mice are much harder to engineer. Maybe it's harder to get the DNA in the reproductive cells. Maybe it's harder to raise the engineered mice. Maybe. There are unknowns that could take us time to troubleshoot and figure out how to fix it. So what I will tell you is the earliest possible date that you would be able to vote on whether to release these mice is probably 7 years from now. That's the earliest possible. Because you gotta keep in mind, we have to get FDA approval we have to make the mouse, we have to breed up 1,000 of them for a small island field trial. We have to wait 2 full years for the results of that field trial, the independent study of ecologists. We need FDA approval, probably, or possibly EPA approval. We need state fish and wildlife approval. We need your approval. And at any point, the steering committee can say, nope, that's it, Nantucket's out, and we walk away.
Could I just interject that 7 years, it sounded like I heard some gasping. Taking a new drug through trials, getting it approved, getting it on the market so it does something, typically takes way longer than 7 years. And actually, if in 7 years you were doing this, I mean, that's not that long for such a tremendous achievement, if in fact it was an achievement. So
Yeah,
I understand it's not going to happen tomorrow, but these things take time.
If I could comment, there is a new candidate Lyme disease vaccine, but the earliest we would see it is 2026. That's the estimate from the company. But the other thing is, I hope people don't see this effort or things like deer reduction as helping you now. This is an effort to make things better for our children and their children. And I think that's really the most important motivator of all.
Another relevant thing is, how long would it last if you did it? And this we'll know a little bit more after a field trial and seeing how fit these mice are relative to wild ones. And we know that from everything we know, the overwhelming evidence suggests that the resistance is not going to help the mice. So it will likely slowly go away, but it should be slow. That is, we would expect that the immunity would last for decades once done. And that's what makes this different, is that it will last a long time on a human timescale. On an evolutionary timescale, I blink, because evolution has the last word. And in that sense, life finds a way. Whatever we do, it will eventually undo it. But on our timescale, many decades is pretty good.
Yeah, like 100 years would be okay. We would take that, right? Another question? Yes.
Just thinking about the Lone Star thing again, you mentioned that you were going to engineer the mice possibly to kill the ticks. Would they kill the Lone Star tick?
So that requires some immunology research to figure out what the right targets are and how the immune system can target the different kinds of ticks.
But the point is that the Lone Star tick is a deer and bird tick. It doesn't feed on mice, whatever. And so we would need to find some way of manipulating a deer to do the same thing. No, they're perfectly capable of taking over regardless of what we do. Just ask anybody on Long Island.
That said, if you wanted us to do that, we could engineer the Lone Stars themselves to remove them. but the tick generation time is still 2 years. That's actually longer than a deer generation. So the faster way to do it would be to engineer the deer. If you want us to engineer the deer to be immune to kill lone stars, then let us know. That's the sort of thing that could be on the table.
That's for next week. Okay, this is not necessarily the last question, but it's the last T-shirt.
I am fully in support of vegetation management. Jim Lentowski, recently retired from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, has been a pioneer in trying to manage the habitat out here. If you go along Sconset Road and look up towards as you're approaching the Nantucket Golf Course, there's now what is called the Savannah. And some of his people have put up nice wooden animals reminiscent of the African savanna out there. But if you took a walk there and then walk in the adjacent properties where that vegetation has not been managed, you would see a very clear difference in the number of ticks and mice and deer. And so, yes, we could manage vegetation. It's just that there's only so much you can do. I think he was able to push that along because of an agreement with the Nantucket Golf Course. But to go in and actually clear cut would be a very expensive thing to do. I would love to talk to anyone who would like to pursue some of this. After all, what we see out there, it's not the original vegetation. Once upon a time, you could see from end to end of Nantucket because it was all sheep pasture. And so what is natural and what is worth protecting in terms of vegetation, a lot of it is invasive species. It's, and there's poison ivy and greenbrier. It's all junk vegetation. So that is, just another possibility that people need to think about. And like I said, this is a complex problem. There is no one magic bullet. We need to think as you're doing to try to do all sorts of things simultaneously.
I think we have time for one more. I don't have a T-shirt, but you can ask.
Actually, Nantucket is one of the easier places to study because of the cottage hospital. People who are here for more than 2 weeks will certainly be seen, a large number of them will be seen as cases. And so you can't capture all the cases, but what you do is you compare before and after, and there's an assumption implicit that the same proportion of people before treatment, before we make an intervention, will be that proportion will be the same after the intervention, and so you can compare the two numbers. But just, I think the other thing is just when we reduce deer on Great Island, which is the peninsula on Lewis Bay as you're coming out of Hyannis on the left, prior to reducing the deer, everybody complained about ticks. Now no one's complaining about ticks, so in a sense, the community itself judges whether it's been successful.
Two things. One, I personally would like to thank you all for coming and being so interested. As a journalist, you don't actually see this kind of sustained interest, and it's exciting. And also, I think you should thank these people because they're very talented and have spent an endless amount of time. Thanks.